There's something oddly poetic about how even the brightest stars in Hollywood can't escape the quiet war that is aging. In an industry built on youth, allure, and image, growing older feels like a betrayal land. No betrayal is more visible than hair loss. During the golden age of Hollywood and even slightly beyond, many of its leading men, those who had once set hearts racing and box offices booming, found themselves waging a losing battle against their receding hairlines. But instead of surrendering to nature's course, they turned to what was then a brave new world: hair transplants. Fortunately, the techniques were still in their infancy. Unlike today's highly refined follicular unit extraction methods, early transplants were crude, invasive, and often left visible scars, both physical and emotional. The result? Some of Hollywood's most iconic faces, walking around with what looked like patches of doll hair, uneven forests, or worse. Patchwork nightmares barely held together by pomade, lighting tricks, and the sheer hope that no one would notice. And yet everyone noticed. These weren't just cosmetic missteps. They were public disasters that haunted interviews, performances, and close-up shots. Almost tragic when you realize that these men, adored for their charisma and talent, were quietly burdened by insecurities, convinced that their worth was somehow tied to the hair on their heads, and in trying to preserve their fame, they made themselves even more vulnerable to ridicule. Let's take a closer look at the stars who suffered through these disastrous procedures. Pioneers. Perhaps, but at what cost? Take Frank Sinatra for example, a man whose very voice could melt an audience, yet behind the suave tuxedo and smoldering eyes was a scalp that bore the price of early cosmetic ambition. Sinatra was among the first major celebrities to undergo a hair transplant in the 1960s, and let's just say it wasn't subtle. Using what's known today as the plug method, surgeons removed small, round clusters of hair from the back of his head and inserted them into the top and front of his scalp. Instead of mimicking natural hair growth, these plugs grew in. Little tufted, thick, wiry patches surrounded by bare skin. To the casual observer from a distance, it might have looked okay, but cameras are unforgiving. And under the bright lights of television studios and magazine shoots, the unnatural pattern became glaring. The strands grew in the wrong direction. The density was inconsistent. The texture didn't match. Imagine trying to style a garden where each plant grew its own wild way. No amount of grooming could make it look unified. What made it worse was Sinatra's devotion to his image. He leaned heavily on stylists and lighting specialists to mask the problem, even going as far as banning certain camera angles. But the truth had a way of slipping through. During one live broadcast in 1965, the heat of the studio lights caused his carefully arranged pomade to melt, and his hair began to separate, revealing the plugs beneath. It was humiliating. Not just because of how it looked, but because of what it symbolized. How even someone as powerful and iconic as Sinatra felt the crushing need to cover up something as natural as aging. His story was less about vanity and more about fear. Fear of becoming invisible, irrelevant, or unworthy in an industry that worshipped youth and discarded everything else. Now imagine Burt Reynolds, the rugged, confident star of Smokey and the Bandit, known for his effortless charm and smoldering masculinity. Reynolds wasn't a golden age actor per se, but his hair transplant journey began just as the old guard was fading out. And sadly, his results weren't much better than his predecessors. In the early 1970s, Reynolds underwent a series of surgical transplants that were supposed to restore his receding hairline. Instead, they gave him what critics would call the helmet look. His new hairline was sharp, straight, and jarringly low, lacking any of the natural dips and curves a real hairline has. To make matters worse, the hair grew in odd, unpredictable directions, and the texture differed dramatically from his surrounding hair, creating a jigsaw puzzle of thick tufts and sparse patches. At a distance, it looked like a wig. Up close, it looked worse. Reynolds, who was never one to shy away from bravado, later admitted the procedure was a mistake. Over the years, he tried to correct the damage with additional surgeries, but each attempt only introduced new problems: scarring, poor regrowth, and even more unnatural density. He reportedly became self-conscious on set, insisting on specific lighting and camera placement. And while his confidence always seemed unshakable on screen, behind the scenes he was fighting a battle that no one saw. His natural charisma would have been enough. His talent, humor, and presence were his real strengths. But the pressure to maintain the illusion of eternal youth drove him to medical interventions that ultimately compromised the very thing he was trying to protect: his authenticity. In the end, Reynolds' story isn't about a botched hairline. It's about how even the most confident men can be undone by the whisper of doubt, especially when the world is watching. And then there's William Shatner, Captain Kirk himself, whose hair became almost as talked about as his acting. Shatner's transplant journey began quietly in the late 1960s, when the early signs of baldness started to show. Men constantly in front of high-definition cameras, even by the standards of the time, this was cause for concern. He turned to hair restoration techniques that were common for the era: plug grafts and scalp reductions. The problem was, these procedures didn't age well. Instead of a natural recession, his hairline remained oddly fixed, thick, and low-defying, the natural patterns of aging. As Shatner's face matured, his hair stayed the same, creating an eerie mismatch that viewers couldn't ignore. And while fans joked lovingly about his space-age hairline, the truth was more painful. The plugs were densely packed, giving his scalp a brush-like appearance. And the scarring from multiple surgeries made it impossible for him to ever go completely bald. He was quite literally trapped by his transplant. Behind the scenes, stylists had to get creative. Wiglets hair fibers, strategic lighting, and even painted-on scalp fillers became routine. What's ironic is that Shatner, charismatic, intelligent, and deeply talented, was never truly defined by his looks. His voice, his cadence, his iconic delivery, that was his appeal. And yet, he couldn't escape the weight of looking the part. Like others before him, Shatner's struggle with his hair wasn't about ego. It was about survival in a business that equates hair with vitality and thinning scalps with obsolescence. One of the most poignant examples of hair transplant misfortune belongs to Sammy Davis Jr., the wildly talented Rat Pack performer who could sing, dance, act, and charm anyone he met. But when it came to his hair, Sammy made a misstep that still stings in retrospect. In the late 1960s, Davis underwent a transplant that created a dense, unnatural tuft at the front of his scalp, meant to simulate a fuller hairline. The problem was, it didn't match anything else. His natural hair had thinned considerably on the sides and back, and the transplant made this imbalance even more glaring. Worse still, the lighting from his frequent nightclub performances created sharp shadows across his scalp, highlighting the artificial density. Under the spotlight, the plugs weren't just visible, they were exaggerated. Sammy, always the consummate professional, tried to disguise it with pompadours, gels, and dyes. But over time, the constant manipulation took its toll. The remaining natural hair became brittle, overworked, and thin. Eventually, he resorted to layering in hair extensions, a strategy that only made the artificialness more pronounced. Davis's story cuts a little deeper, though, because his stage presence was so commanding, so full of soul and movement, that he shouldn't have needed anything else. But even he, with all his talent and charm, felt the pressure to appear complete. To audiences, he was unstoppable. But in his dressing room, looking in the mirror, he was a man trying to stitch together an image the world told him he had to maintain. That's the saddest part about these stories. It's not the bad transplants that stay with you. The idea that even icons, men who made history with their voices, their films, their charisma, still felt like they weren't enough if their hair began to go. When it comes to hair transplant disasters, few are as infamous or strangely as transformative as Elton John's. The procedures he underwent in the 1970s left him with uneven, sparse patches of transplanted hair that looked, frankly, worse than the baldness he was trying to hide. Back then, the most commonly used method was the punch graft technique, a primitive process where small circular plugs of scalp, each containing several hair follicles, were extracted from the back of the head and inserted into the balding areas. The problem with this approach was that the plugs grew in clumps, in clearly visible geometric patterns. The transplanted hair didn't just look unnatural, it defied every law of how real hair behaves. It grew in mismatched directions. It had uneven density, and it refused to blend in. Styling it became a nightmare. For Elton, it was a constant visual reminder that science hadn't yet caught up with vanity. Eventually, he gave up trying to salvage it and instead leaned into his hair loss in the most Elton John way possible by turning it into a show. Wigs, toupees, outrageous hats, these became part of his larger-than-life persona. And ironically, what started as a failed attempt to look normal ended up enhancing his brand. His boldness in embracing artificial hair not only salvaged his look, but turned it into fashion. It became a key piece of his flamboyant on-stage identity. Unlike others who tried to hide their hair issues, Elton turned his into a spectacle. And in doing so, he showed the world that you don't need real hair to have real style. Then there's Sean Connery, the original James Bond, whose early attempts at hair restoration were so ill-fated that they've become something of a legend among fans of both cinema and cosmetic surgery. In the early 1970s, Connery, then in his prime and still commanding global attention, underwent several hair transplant procedures using the same outdated plug technique that had failed so many before him. The results were, to put it kindly, underwhelming. The transplanted hair had a different color and texture from the rest of his hair, resulting in a jarring patchwork effect. Worse, the spacing of the plugs formed a clear pattern that looked more like a quilt than a head of hair. Rather than enhancing his rugged charm, the results left him looking oddly artificialist, especially in close-up shots. But here's where Connery's story takes a more empowering turn. Rather than continue down the path of corrective surgeries and cover-ups, he eventually said, enough. He shaved it all off. And in doing so, he changed the game. Connery, once reliant on a thick head of hair to define his sex appeal, suddenly became even more alluring as a bald man. His confidence didn't waver, in fact, it grew. His decision to embrace his natural look made baldness not just acceptable, but desirable. In many ways, Connery's transformation redefined masculine aging in Hollywood. He proved that dignity, presence, and confidence weren't rooted in follicles, but in how you carried yourself. His story is a reminder that letting go of the illusion can sometimes be more powerful than the illusion itself. Now let's talk about Marlon Brando, arguably one of the greatest actors of all time, but also one of the most secretive when it came to his appearance. For years, rumors swirled about Brando's hair, particularly as he aged into the roles that would cement his legacy, like Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather. But recent revelations have confirmed that Brando underwent several failed transplant procedures during the 1970s, and the results were catastrophic. Like others of his era, Brando fell victim to the punch graft technique. The result was an unnaturally low and sharply straight hairline that didn't suit the shape of his face or the grace of his aging features. The transplanted hair grew in chaotic directions, and the density varied so much that his scalp ended up looking like a patch of grass struggling to grow through cracked pavement. One makeup artist who worked with him famously described it that way, and he wasn't exaggerating. Brando was so embarrassed by the outcome that he spent the rest of his career refusing to be photographed without a hat, a wig, or some sort of hairpiece. What makes Brando's case particularly tragic is that his natural baldness would have worked beautifully for the roles he played later in life. A bald Brando, weathered and wise, would have looked every bit the aging lion he so often portrayed, but instead he became a prisoner to his artificial hairline, stuck in a cycle of cover-ups and concealment. He had the talent, the gravitas, and the legacy, but not the peace of mind that comes with self-acceptance. His story underscores how the pressure to preserve youth can distort not only a person's appearance, but also their sense of self. It's important to understand why all of these transplants look so jarringly bad, because the fault didn't entirely lie with the stars. In truth, the hair restoration techniques available in the 1960s and 1970s were closer to guesswork than science. The standard approach was called punch grafting, where circular patches of scalp about 4 millimeters in diameter were removed. from the back of the head and transplanted to the front or crown. It sounds simple, but the complications were many. These plugs were far too large and contained too many follicles per graft, resulting in what we now call the doll hair look: thick, widely spaced tufts surrounded by visible scalp. Matters worse, hair doesn't grow in circles. It grows in subtle spirals, waves, and blends. These plug transplants ignored the natural angle and flow of real hair. So when the plugs took root, they often grew in random directions: straight, up, sideways, even backwards. The outcome was not just unnatural, but often grotesque. And it wasn't just the look that suffered. The procedures left scarring both at the donor sites and the recipient areas. The backs of these men's heads were often riddled with polka dot scars, while the top of their scalps had raised. Lumpy marks that were nearly impossible to hide under makeup or styling products. The surgeons performing these procedures weren't always hair restoration specialists either. Often, they were general cosmetic surgeons applying a mechanical solution to an artistic problem. They focused on transplanting the hair, not how it should look once it grew, and the stars. They were desperate enough to believe that any solution was better than none at all. What's rarely discussed, though, is the toll these disasters took on the actors mentally and emotionally. The psychological impact was profound. These weren't just cosmetic mistakes, they were identity crises. For actors whose careers were built on being seen, to suddenly feel like they had to hide a part of themselves was devastating. Many became deeply self-conscious, withdrawing from public events or becoming obsessive about lighting, camera angles, and wardrobe. Some developed behaviors that psychologists today would recognize as symptoms of body dysmorphic disorder: obsessive preoccupation with perceived flaws in their appearance. The more they tried to fix the problem, the worse it got. Additional surgeries compounded the damage, leading to more scars, more irregular growth, and even more emotional distress. Careers were quietly affected too. Directors had to work around. The actors' bad side scenes had to be blocked a certain way, and stylists became indispensable. Personal lives suffered as well. Some actors became reclusive, reluctant to form new relationships or appear in candid photos. What began as a simple attempt to hold on to their looks spiraled into a battle with self-esteem that lasted for decades. And all of this happened in a time when mental health wasn't openly discussed, and male vulnerability was often brushed off or hidden altogether. And yet, from all of this emerged something valuable: lessons. The horror stories of the past became the cautionary tales that led to a renaissance in hair restoration. Surgeons began to understand that this wasn't just a surgical procedure, it was a form of art. They studied hair growth patterns, proportions, and how hair changes with age. Techniques evolved. Plug grafts gave way to micrografts, then to follicular unit transplantation, and eventually to today's advanced follicular unit extraction, where individual hairs are harvested and implanted with precision. Surgeons started counseling patients before surgery, managing expectations, and even advising against the procedure if the results wouldn't be aesthetically appropriate. The mental health component improved as well today. Reputable clinics assess whether a patient is emotionally prepared and help them understand that hair